I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The village of St. Mary Mead was currently under the delightful, if somewhat frantic, spell of the annual chrysanthemum competition. It was the sort of event that brought out the very best in the village's horticulture and the very worst in its social temperaments. Miss Jane Marple, armed with a pair of sturdy gardening gloves and a basket of raffia, stood near the edge of the vicarage garden, observing the flurry of activity. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sharp, spicy fragrance of the prize-winning blooms, but to Miss Marple's finely tuned senses there was another scent altogether, that of a brewing human storm. The weather was uncommonly clear for autumn, the sky a crisp pale blue that seemed to highlight every frayed nerve of the competitors. The focal point of the afternoon's tension was old Mr. Henderson's prized garden hut, a sturdy structure of weathered oak that sat at the far end of his orchard, just beyond a row of meticulously pruned apple trees. Henderson, a man of legendary grumpiness and even more legendary botanical secrets, had spent the morning sequestered inside, purportedly applying a final secret liquid fertilizer to his gold standard blossoms. His daughter, Letitia, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched by the burden of her father's eccentricities, was moving among the guests with a forced smile and a tray of lemonade that looked decidedly sour. She wore a dress of somewhat dated cut, its fabric straining slightly at the seams as she reached to offer a glass to the local apothecary, Mr. Gillingham. "It is quite remarkable," Miss Marple remarked to the vicar's wife, who was hovering nearby with a look of mild desperation, "how much importance we attach to a few petals. Mr. Henderson has been in that hut since 9 o'clock. He reminds me so much of the old fishmonger in my youth, a man who believed that if he stayed behind a locked door long enough, the world would eventually pay him the tribute of curiosity. But curiosity, I'm afraid, is often a very dangerous thing to cultivate, especially when it is paired with such a stubborn bolt on the door." As the clock struck 4, the appointed time for the judging, a small crowd gathered at the orchard gate. Sir George, the local magistrate and chief judge, adjusted his monocle and marched toward the hut with the self-importance of a man who considered a chrysanthemum competition to be a matter of national security. He rapped his silver-headed cane against the oak door with a sharp, authoritative rhythm that seemed to echo through the quiet orchard. "Come along, Henderson. Time is up. Let's see these wonders of yours. We can't keep the committee waiting all day, you know," Sir George shouted, his voice booming across the lawn. There was no answer. The silence that followed was heavy and unnerving, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a wood pigeon in the elms. Sir George tried the handle, twisting it with increasing frustration, but it remained motionless. He leaned his shoulder against the wood, but the door was clearly secured from the inside by a heavy iron bolt. He then moved to the small, grimy window, but the interior was obscured by a thick green canvas curtain that Henderson had installed specifically to thwart prying eyes and protect his gold standard from the light. "Henderson, this is no time for games," Sir George shouted, his face turning a shade of crimson that rivaled the prize begonias. He looked back at the crowd, his irritation turning into a genuine creeping unease. "He's probably fallen asleep in there. The man's 80 if he's a day." It was young Dickie Thorne, the village's most energetic and least employed young man, who suggested breaking the door. Dickie was always eager for a bit of physical exertion, especially if it distracted from the fact that he owed half the village for various small debts. With a heave and a collective gasp from the gathered ladies, the heavy oak finally gave way. The door swung inward with a violent crack of the internal bolt which had been forced from its socket by the sheer pressure of Dickie's shoulder. The hut did not smell of flowers. It smelled of something cold, metallic and final. Old Mr. Henderson was not standing over his chrysanthemums with a watering can. He was slumped across his potting bench, his head resting among the shattered remains of a terracotta pot. His eyes were wide, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the orchard, and his right hand was still clutching a small glass vial that had spilled its contents onto the wooden floor. The prize-winning gold standard stood nearby, its petals vibrant and mocking in the afternoon light. "Good heavens," whispered the vicar, stepping forward and crossing himself. The door was bolted from the inside, the windows are barred with iron. He must have taken his own life. To think he would choose such a moment, with the whole village waiting at his door. Miss Marple did not join the throng of gasping onlookers, or the frantic movements of the men trying to find a pulse. She remained at the threshold, her eyes busy cataloguing the minute details of the room with a terrifying efficiency. She noted the way the green canvas curtain was slightly snagged on a nail, and how a single perfect chrysanthemum had been crushed beneath the heel of Henderson's own boot. Most curiously, she noticed a small damp patch on the sleeve of his tweed jacket, a patch that smelled faintly of peppermint, a scent entirely out of place in a gardener's sanctuary. "It is a very sad business," she murmured to herself, her voice lost in the rising murmur of the crowd and the first sharp cry of distress from Letitia Henderson. A very sad business indeed, but one must always wonder why a man who intended to leave the world would bother to bolt the door against it so firmly. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Spenlow, who always locked his coal cellar because he was terrified someone would steal the dust, never realizing the real thief was already in the parlor with the tea tray. The judging was over, but the mystery of the bolted hut had only just begun. As the first screams of realization began to echo toward the village green, and the local constable was summoned from his tea, Miss Marple quietly tucked a stray strand of grey hair beneath her hat. A man was dead in a room no one could enter, yet she was quite certain that the key to his death was currently standing on the lawn, drinking lemonade, and looking far too relieved for a person whose world had just collapsed. The sun began to dip behind the old elms of the churchyard, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to creep across the orchard like accusing fingers. While the body of old Mr. Henderson remained slumped over his potting bench, the villagers were ushered back toward the main lawn of the vicarage. The transition from a horticultural celebration to a scene of sudden, violent death was so jarring that for a few moments a thick, unnatural silence hung over the assembly. However, as the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by a low, persistent hum of speculation. In St. Mary Mead, as Miss Marple had long ago observed, the machinery of gossip required very little fuel to reach a roaring heat, and a death in a locked room provided enough material for a dozen contradictory theories before the police had even arrived. Miss Marple sat on her folding chair, her lavender wool once again moving rhythmically through her fingers. She observed how the villagers had naturally sorted themselves into small, tight-knit groups, each one acting as a microcosm of suspicion. To her left, Mrs. Price Ridley was holding court with a sharp, bird-like intensity. "It's a clear case of despair," she hissed, her voice carrying a practiced authority that brooked no contradiction. Poor Henderson was always a man of fragile nerves, despite that gruff exterior. With the mortgage on the nursery looming and the rumours that his new hybrid had failed to bloom, he simply found the pressure too much. And to bolt himself in, that is the final act of a man who wanted no interference from a world that had disappointed him. It's exactly like that poor soul in Nether Addington, who did the very same thing with a charcoal brazier. Some people simply cannot bear to be seen in their moment of failure. Miss Marple's needles never faltered, but her eyes flickered toward Letitia Henderson. The daughter was standing near the stone bird bath, her face a mask of pale, frozen grief that didn't quite reach her eyes. Letitia was not weeping. She was watching Sir George and the vicar with a strange, calculating stillness. It reminded Miss Marple of young Fanny Higgins, who had once broken a very expensive vase and spent the next hour carefully arranging the shards to look as though the cat had done it. There was a sense of deliberate posture in Letitia's sorrow, that felt more like a shield than a wound. She was smoothing the fabric of her dated dress with a repetitive motion that suggested a mind busy with far more than just mourning. To her right, the gossip took a darker turn. Dickie Thorne was leaning against a cider barrel, surrounded by a group of younger men who looked both frightened and fascinated by the afternoon's violence. "He didn't look like a man who'd done himself in," Dickie whispered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl as he glanced nervously toward the hut. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost. And what about that vial? My uncle says Henderson wouldn't know a poison from a peony. He was a dirt-under-the-fingernails gardener, not a chemist. If you ask me, someone found a way into that hut. Maybe through the floorboards or the roof. There's talk that he had a cache of gold sovereigns hidden under the flagstones, and someone wanted them more than he did. Why else would he be so paranoid about the locks and the bars? The theory of a hidden treasure began to circulate with the speed of a summer flu. Within minutes, the narrative had shifted from a tragic suicide to a daring burglary by a phantom intruder who could move through solid oak. Miss Weatherby joined Miss Marple, her face flushed with the excitement of the unfolding drama. "Oh, Jane, isn't it dreadful? They're saying now that it might have been a secret passage." To think of a murderer creeping through the orchard while we were all laughing over tea and scones. It makes one feel so very unsafe in one's own garden. And Letitia, poor girl, to lose her father just as they were about to sell the prize bulbs. She'll be quite alone now, though I suppose she'll inherit everything. Not that it's much, from what the bank manager's wife tells me. Apparently the nursery hasn't turned a profit since the war. Miss Marple looked at her friend with a gaze that was both compassionate and profoundly realistic. "It is quite fascinating, Caroline, how we always prefer a ghost or a secret passage to the reality of a closed door. We want the world to be a sensational novel, because the truth of human nature is often much more mundane and much more distressing. People are already talking of gold and phantoms because they don't want to look at the fact that Mr. Henderson was a man who lived a very isolated, perhaps very difficult life with his daughter. Suicides do happen, of course, but a man who is proud enough to grow a gold-standard chrysanthemum is usually a man who wants to be there to see it win the prize. He was a man of immense vanity, and vanity is a very strong tether to this world. The arrival of the local constable provided a new focus for the village's collective energy. He was a young man clearly out of his depth, and he spent a great deal of time shooing people away from the orchard gate, while waiting for the inspector to arrive from Much Benham. The villagers watched his every move, interpreting each adjustment of his helmet as a sign of progress. The consensus was rapidly dividing into two camps, the tragic suicide faction led by the vicar's wife, and the mysterious intruder faction led by Mrs. Price Ridley. Yet, beneath the noise, Miss Marple noticed a few people who were not participating in the gossip. The village doctor, Dr. Haydock, was standing by his car, looking toward the hut with a deep professional frown. He wasn't talking, he was thinking. And then there was the local apothecary, Mr. Gillingham, who was quietly slipping away toward the village square, his hands deep in his pockets and his head bowed. Miss Marple recalled that Henderson had been a frequent visitor to Gillingham's shop, ostensibly for pest control chemicals. The village reacts in the only way it knows how, Miss Marple mused to herself, her needles clicking a soft counterpoint to the distant sirens. By turning a tragedy into a theatre, they see the bolted door and they see the vial, and they assume the story is finished. But a bolted door is a very specific piece of theatre, and a vial is a very specific prop. It reminds me so much of the time the old schoolmaster disappeared from his locked study, only to be found in the pantry. He hadn't been abducted, he had simply been hiding from his sister-in-law. The methods of concealment are many, but the reason is always rooted in the heart. And Mr. Henderson's heart, I fear, was full of more than just flowers. It was full of the kind of secrets that peppermint is used to hide. As the evening light turned a bruised purple, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into a state of uneasy, electrified anticipation. The gossip had served its purpose. It had created a wall of noise that obscured the finer details of the scene. No one mentioned the peppermint scent, and no one mentioned the crushed flower that shouldn't have been under the gardener's own heel. They were too busy discussing gold and ghosts. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and prepared to wait. She knew that the early investigation would follow the path of least resistance, and that the truth would require someone to look not at the locks on the door, but at the locks on the souls of those left behind. The arrival of Inspector Slack was, as was customary for that energetic and abrasive gentleman, heralded by the aggressive crunch of tires on gravel and the forceful slamming of a car door that seemed to startle the very birds from the orchard trees. He strode into the garden with his notebook already open, his sharp eyes darting about with a clinical suspicion that seemed to accuse the prize-winning chrysanthemums of being accessories after the fact. To Inspector Slack, a crime scene was not a theatre of human emotion, but a series of physical puzzles to be bullied into a reportable shape as quickly as possible. He immediately ordered the orchard to be cleared of all civilians, a directive that caused Mrs. Price Ridley to retreat with a look of profound indignation, her theory on the phantom intruder momentarily silenced by the weight of official authority. Miss Marple, however, remained in her chair on the periphery of the lawn, her needles clicking with a soft, rhythmic persistence that the inspector had long ago learned he could not easily displace. She watched him disappear into the garden hut, followed by a photographer and a constable carrying a fingerprint kit. To the inspector, the bolted door was the primary piece of evidence, a mechanical fact that simplified the world. If a man is found dead in a room with the door bolted from the inside and the windows barred, the law of physics dictates a solitary end. Miss Marple, however, was far more interested in the laws of character, which often bypassed the laws of physics entirely. "It is quite remarkable, is it not, Alice?" Miss Marple remarked to the vicar's wife, who was hovering nearby with a tray of cold tea that no one seemed inclined to drink. "The inspector is so very thorough with his tape measures and his chalk. He sees the bolt on the door, and he sees the vial in poor Mr. Henderson's hand, and he believes he is looking at a finished tapestry. It reminds me so much of the time the local clockmaker in St. Mary Mead was found trapped in his own workshop. Everyone assumed he had locked himself in by accident, but they failed to notice that the clock he was working on had been set forward by 20 minutes. People are so very predictable when they are trying to be clever, yet they always leave a small human smudge on their handiwork. One must look for the smudge, not the bolt." As the early investigation unfolded, Miss Marple's attention was drawn away from the hut and toward the behavior of those remaining on the lawn. She noticed Letitia Henderson, who was now sitting on a stone bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Letitia was not looking at the hut. She was looking at the small silver tea strainer on the vicarage table. Her eyes were fixed on it with a peculiar, almost hypnotic intensity. To a casual observer, she was a woman in shock. To Miss Marple, she looked like a woman who was mentally checking a list. She noted how Letitia's fingers occasionally twitched against her skirt, as if she were counting something, a habit Miss Marple had once seen in a very nervous bank clerk who had been borrowing from the till. Then there was the matter of Dickie Thorne. The young man had not left the orchard entirely. He was hovering near the hedge, his face a complex mask of anxiety and a strange, suppressed excitement. He was repeatedly reaching into his jacket pocket and then pulling his hand out again, as if checking for the presence of an object that both terrified and comforted him. Miss Marple recalled that Dickie had been the one to suggest breaking down the door. In her experience, the person who is most eager to force an entry is often the person who wants to be the first to discover the scene, thereby controlling the initial perception of the tragedy. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting toward Letitia every few seconds, seeking a cue that never came. Patterns are such delicate things, Miss Marple mused to herself, her lavender wool growing steadily under her fingers despite the encroaching gloom. The inspector is looking for fingerprints on the glass, but he is ignoring the way the grass has been trodden near the back of the structure. Did you notice, Alice, that there are no footprints in the soft earth beneath the hut window, yet the curtain inside was snagged? If the window was barred and the door was bolted, why would someone need to touch the curtain from the inside in such a hurry? It suggests that someone wanted to look out to see if the coast was clear, not look in. And then there is that scent of peppermint. It is a very clean, very clinical smell, is it not? Quite unlike the heavy, earthy odours of a potting shed. It reminds me of the dentist's surgery, or perhaps a very particular kind of lozenge used to mask the taste of something bitter. She also observed the local apothecary, Mr. Gillingham, who had returned to the edge of the crowd. He was watching Inspector Slack with an expression of profound unease, his lower lip trembling slightly. Gillingham was a man of precise habits, yet he was currently wearing one brown shoe and one black shoe, a discrepancy so glaring that only a man in a state of extreme mental distraction or terror could have overlooked it while dressing. Miss Marple knew that Mr. Henderson had been a difficult customer, always demanding specific chemicals for his horticultural experiments. She wondered if the apothecary had sold him something that wasn't intended for chrysanthemums at all. The early investigation was already falling into the trap of the obvious. Slack emerged from the hut after half an hour, looking satisfied. He spoke briefly to Sir George, and although his words were hushed, the phrase clear-cut suicide drifted across the lawn like a chilling breeze. He had found no evidence of a struggle, no signs of a third party, and a half-written note on the potting bench that spoke of the final bloom and the end of the season. To the police, the bolted door was the beginning and the end of the mystery. They were ready to pack their kits and file their reports, treating the death of old Mr. Henderson as a sad but uncomplicated conclusion to a long, eccentric and debt-ridden life. The inspector sees a closed door, Miss Marple thought, her gaze resting on the crushed chrysanthemum she had noticed earlier near the threshold. But a door is only a barrier if you believe in the permanence of locks. In St. Mary Mead, we have always known that the most effective way to enter a room is to be invited, and the most effective way to leave it is to make everyone believe you were never there at all. That poor flower was stepped on by a boot that was not Mr. Henderson's. The tread is far too fine for a gardener's heavy soul. And that peppermint, it is lingering on the air in a way that chemicals do not. It is the scent of a person's vanity, not a poison's utility. As the police began to cordon off the area with yellow tape, Miss Marple sat back, her needles never pausing. She knew that the obvious conclusion was merely the first layer of a very intricate and carefully planned lie. The village would sleep tonight believing in a tragedy of despair, but Miss Marple was already looking toward the next morning. She needed to know why a man who was about to win a gold medal would write a note about a final bloom in such a shaky hand, and why a daughter who had lived in her father's shadow for 40 years was suddenly so interested in the exact timing of the police's departure. The investigation had only just begun, and the bolted door was not a wall, but a signpost pointing toward a very different kind of crime. By the following morning, the sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive cheerfulness, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the orchard where the police had already established their definitive narrative. Inspector Slack had not spent a restless night. On the only contrary, he had arrived at the village police station with the buoyant stride of a man who had successfully tidied away a messy reality into a neat, bureaucratic folder. To the inspector, the first suspect was not a person at all, but the crushing weight of financial circumstance. He had spent the early hours reviewing old Mr. Henderson's bank statements, which revealed a series of increasingly frantic letters from the local building society. The motive was clear, financial ruin. The method was undeniable, a bolted door. The conclusion was inevitable, a desperate man taking the only exit left to him. "It is an open and shut case, Pringle," Slack barked at his sergeant, as they stood near the orchard gate, unaware of Miss Marple's presence behind a thicket of overgrown hydrangeas. The man was bankrupt. He was obsessed with a flower that probably wouldn't have won anyway, and he locked himself in a hut to avoid facing his daughter or his creditors. We found the source of the poison, a common pesticide concentrate he'd been refining himself in that very shed. There's no point in looking for a villain when the victim has done the job for us. We'll have the inquest over by Friday and be back at headquarters for the weekend. This village has enough gossip as it is without us adding to the fire. Miss Marple, who had been ostensibly pruning her friend's hedge but was actually engaged in the far more rigorous task of eavesdropping, felt a familiar pang of quiet skepticism. She watched as the inspector dismissed Dickie Thorne, who had been brought in for a brief informal questioning regarding his discovery of the body. To Slack, Dickie was merely a helpful if somewhat clumsy local lad. To Miss Marple, however, Dickie's behaviour was increasingly peculiar. He was now wearing a brand-new silk cravat, a flamboyant piece of haberdashery that was entirely out of place for a young man who had claimed to be penniless only 2 days ago. He was walking about the village green with a nervous electric energy, looking for all the world like a cat who had not only caught the canary but had found the bird was made of solid gold. "It is also very efficient, is it not?" Miss Marple remarked to Letitia Henderson, who had come to the vicarage to discuss the funeral arrangements with the vicar's wife. They were sitting in the morning room, the light glinting off the polished silver tea service. The inspector is so very fond of a straight line. He sees the det and the bolt, and he decides the story is finished. It reminds me so much of the time the old schoolmistress in the valley was accused of losing the chapel funds. Everyone was so quick to believe she had spent it on secret extravagances because she had such a quiet, drab life. Nobody thought to look at the obvious culprit, who was the very man who had helped her balance the books. People find it so much easier to believe in a person's hidden despair than in their hidden enemies. Letitia sipped her tea, her hand remarkably steady. "The inspector is right about the debts, Miss Marple. Father was a difficult man. He lived for those flowers, and he didn't care whose lives he spent in the process. If he decided to end things in that hut, it was his final way of remaining in control. He always hated being told what to do by the bank or by me. He was a stubborn old soul, and I suppose the prospect of losing the nursery was more than his pride could bear. It is a relief, in a way, that the police are satisfied. I don't think I could have stood a long, drawn-out investigation." Miss Marple noted the word control. It was a word that Letitia used with a certain sharp relish. She also noticed that Letitia was wearing a very distinctive brooch, a small enamel peppermint leaf that she hadn't seen before. It was a curious choice for a woman in mourning, and the scent of peppermint, faint but persistent, seemed to emanate from the woman herself. It was not the scent of a sweet, but the scent of a very strong industrial-grade mouthwash, or perhaps a chemical masking agent. "The police are very eager to close the file," Miss Marple continued, her blue eyes fixed on the silver tea strainer. "They see the half-written note about the final bloom and they assume it was a suicide note. But you know, dear, in my experience, a gardener who speaks of a final bloom is usually thinking about the next season's catalogue, not the end of his life. And I cannot help but wonder why a man who intended to swallow poison would bother to bolt the door. If one is leaving the world, one rarely worries about the neighbours coming in. One bolts a door because one wants to ensure a specific person cannot get in, or perhaps to ensure that once someone is inside, they cannot get out." The skepticism was not just hers. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly after, looking dissatisfied and carrying his medical bag with a certain protective clench of his fingers. He had performed the preliminary post-mortem and had found something that didn't quite sit right with the suicide narrative. He pulled Miss Marple aside in the hallway, his face a mask of professional doubt. "Jane, the inspector is a fool. He's looking at the vial, but he's not looking at the timing. That pesticide acts almost instantly. If Henderson had swallowed it, he would have dropped the vial. But he was holding it, gripping it, in fact. And the bolt on that door, it's an old-fashioned sliding mechanism. If the door was shaken or struck from the outside before it was broken, a loose bolt could easily have slid into place. It's a common occurrence with those old orchard huts. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. So the bolted room might not have been a choice at all, but a mechanical accident. Which means the inspector's proof of suicide is nothing more than a trick of gravity and a loose screw. And if the room wasn't locked against the world, then the world could have walked right in while the judges were busy with the begonias. She thought of the peppermint scent and the crushed flour. She thought of Dickie Thorne's new silk cravat and Letitia's cold counting fingers. The first suspect was indeed a phantom, but it wasn't a ghost. It was the inspector's own imagination, fueled by a desire for a quick resolution. Miss Marple knew that she had to look beyond the financial records and the locked door. She had to look at the people who stood to gain not from Henderson's death, but from the timing of it. A man who dies before a competition is a man whose secrets are buried with him, whereas a man who wins is a man who is suddenly under the brightest of spotlights. It is a pity, she whispered to herself as she watched Letitia walk down the vicarage drive, that people always assume the elderly don't notice the smell of a cover-up. The inspector has his suspect, a dead man who cannot defend himself, but I think I shall start looking at the living, especially a young man who suddenly has money for silk and a daughter who wears the scent of a dentist's office to her father's funeral. The investigation was no longer about a locked room. It was about a very open secret, and Miss Marple was determined to find the one person in St. Mary Mead who was currently trying very hard to look like they had nothing to hide. The morning mist had finally surrendered to a pale, watery sun as Miss Marple made her way back toward the orchard, her movements deliberate and slow, as if she were merely an elderly lady enjoying the restorative effects of the crisp air. The police tape still fluttered around the garden hut, a garish yellow reminder of the tragedy that had disrupted the village's peace. But the constable on duty had been called away to assist with a traffic mishap near the high street. This left the scene momentarily quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker in the old elm tree. Miss Marple did not approach the hut itself. Instead, she focused her attention on the narrow, stone-paved path that led from the orchard gate to the rear of the potting shed, a path that was largely hidden by a dense screen of untrimmed boxwood. She stopped at a small, moss-covered stone bench and sat down, her eyes scanning the ground with the precision of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. It was here that she noticed a minor, seemingly unimportant detail that the inspector, in his rush to confirm the financial motives of a desperate man, had completely overlooked. Caught in the thorny embrace of a wild briar rose, just a few inches above the soil, was a tiny, jagged fragment of orange silk. It was a mere scrap, no larger than a fingernail, but its color was so vibrant and its texture so fine that it stood out like a beacon against the muted greens and browns of the autumn garden. Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart giving a small, sharp flutter of recognition. She remembered the annual chrysanthemum competition of the previous year and the year before that. Specifically, she remembered a very particular silk ribbon that had been used to tie the highly commended certificates. A ribbon that was an unusual shade of burnt orange. But more importantly, she recalled seeing a similar shock of orange tucked into the breast pocket of Dickie Thorne's old gardening waistcoat just weeks ago. It was a detail that sat in her mind like a misplaced piece of a jigsaw puzzle. Why would a fragment of a young man's finery be snagged on a briar rose behind a hut that was supposedly locked from the inside? "It is quite remarkable," she murmured to herself, her hands reaching into her bag for her knitting, though her gaze never left the orange thread. "How we focus on the mountain and ignore the pebble in our shoe. The inspector is looking for a bottle and a bolt, but he has failed to notice that the garden has been mended in a very peculiar way. It reminds me so much of the time the old colonel's daughter tried to hide the fact that she had been out at a dance by sewing her torn hem with a thread that didn't quite match the fabric. She thought the darkness would hide the discrepancy, but the sunlight is a very cruel witness to a hurried repair, She rose from the bench and moved a few steps further along the path, where the earth was soft and damp from the morning dew. There, beneath the overhang of the hut's rear gutter, she found the second part of the detail, a small rectangular indentation in the mud. It was not a footprint, nor was it the mark of a gardening tool. It was the distinct impression of a heavy, metal-bound ledger. To anyone else it would have been a meaningless smudge, but to Miss Marple it suggested a very specific sequence of events. Someone had been standing behind the hut, hidden by the boxwood, and they had been holding something heavy enough to leave a mark when they rested it against the wall. A ledger, she mused, her needles beginning to click a soft, pensive rhythm. A gardener like Mr. Henderson kept his records in his head, or perhaps on the back of a seed packet. He was not a man for formal accounts. That was Letitia's domain. And yet the inspector says the motive was debt. If the debt was so overwhelming, why was the ledger being handled behind the hut on the day of the competition, rather than being discussed in the parlour? It suggests that the debt was not a private tragedy, but a public weapon. It reminds me of the business with the local draper, who was convinced he was being blackmailed because a ledger had been altered to show a deficit that didn't exist. The theft wasn't the money, the theft was the man's reputation. She also noticed a third, even smaller detail. On the underside of a large hosta leaf near the ledger mark, there was a tiny crystalline deposit of white powder. She touched it with a gloved finger and brought it to her nose. It didn't smell of peppermint, nor did it smell of pesticide. It had a faint, sweet scent, the scent of powdered sugar. This was the detail that truly troubled her. Why would there be sugar on the ground behind a locked potting shed? In the village of St. Mary Mead, sugar was associated with tea, with baking, and with the Gillingham special lozenges that the apothecary sold for persistent coughs. Lozenges that were notoriously effective because they contained a mild sedative. Sugar and silk, Miss Marple whispered, her eyes clouding with the weight of her deductions, and a ledger that was never meant to be seen. The inspector sees a man who swallowed poison in a fit of pique, but I see a man who was being systematically prepared for his end. If you want a man to look like a suicide, you must first make him look like a failure. You must ensure he is confused, perhaps a little drowsy from a sedative in his tea, and then you must provide the means and the opportunity. The peppermint was not a chemical, it was a masking agent for the sedative, and the sugar was the residue of the bait. She realized that the bolted door was the ultimate red herring. If Mr. Henderson had been drowsy, he might have stumbled and struck the door, causing the loose bolt to slide home by sheer accident. Or perhaps someone had reached through the small, high ventilation slit at the back with a long, thin rod to nudge the bolt into place after the deed was done. The orange silk suggested that Dickie Thorne had been the one to do the nudging, but the ledger and the sugar pointed toward a much more domestic hand. The daughter had the motive of inheritance and the mastery of the books. The young man had the agility and the need for quick cash. A partnership, Miss Marple concluded, her gaze settling on the vicarage spire in the distance. But a partnership born of convenience, not of affection. They have used the village's own expectations against it. They knew that everyone expected old Henderson to be grumpy and broke, so they made him look bankrupt. They knew everyone expected a locked room to be a suicide, so they made sure the room was locked, but they forgot that a garden is a living thing, and it does not like to be lied to. A briar rose does not snag a silk cravat without a reason, and sugar does not fall from the sky. As she walked back toward the village green, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of clarity. The minor details, the orange thread, the ledger mark and the sugar had provided the bridge between the mechanical facts of the inspector and the psychological truths of the heart. The investigation was no longer about a debt-ridden man. It was about a calculated execution that had been dressed up as a tragedy. She adjusted her shawl, her mind already moving toward the confrontations that would be necessary to break the suspect's composure. She needed to find out who had bought the orange cravat, and she needed to see the inside of that ledger before Letitia Henderson had a chance to tidy the records one last time. The shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the vicarage drawing-room, turning the floral wallpaper into a forest of shifting skeletal shapes. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair near the hearth, the fire casting a soft orange glow that failed to touch the coldness in the eyes of the guests she had invited for a quiet discussion of the parish accounts. The room was thick with the scent of lavender and old paper, but beneath it lay the sharp metallic tang of unvoiced fear. Letitia Henderson sat stiffly on the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands clutching a black beaded handbag with such ferocity that the knuckles were bone white. Opposite her, Dickie Thorne leaned against the mantelpiece, his new silk cravat a garish splash of orange that seemed to pulse in the dim light. He was attempting an air of bored indifference, but the frantic tapping of his foot against the fender betrayed a spirit that was far from at ease. "It is quite remarkable," Miss Marple began, her voice a gentle rhythmic hum that seemed to mimic the clicking of her needles, "how a single event can peel back the layers of a village like an onion. We all thought we knew Mr. Henderson. We saw the gruff gardener, the man dedicated to the glory of his chrysanthemums. But beneath that exterior, there was a man who understood the value of a secret, especially when that secret could be converted into modern currency. He wasn't just growing flowers in that hut. He was growing a very lucrative side business in rare, illegally imported bulbs that the Ministry of Agriculture would have been very interested to discuss. And he kept the records of those transactions in a very specific, heavy, metal-bound ledger that seems to have gone missing from the study." Letitia's face remained a mask of frozen porcelain, but her voice was sharp and defensive. "My father was a gardener, Miss Marple, not a smuggler of plants. If he had debts, they were honest ones brought on by a declining market. This talk of ledgers and illegal bulbs is nothing more than village gossip fueled by a lack of better things to do. The inspector has already seen the bank statements I provided. We were on the verge of losing the nursery, and he simply could not face the shame of the auction block. That is why he locked that door." "Is that what the bank statements showed, dear?" Miss Marple asked, her blue eyes looking up with a piercing clarity that silenced the room. "Or is that what the ledger was altered to show before it was shown to the police? You see, I was thinking of the time the old station master in the valley was accused of theft. It turned out his daughter had been adjusting the books for years, not to steal the money for herself initially, but to make her father believe he was failing. She wanted him to retire so she could sell the land to a developer and move to the city. It is a very common human failing to believe that we are helping someone by making them dependent on our own competence. You handled the accounts, Letitia. You knew that if the nursery was seen to be failing, the bank would foreclose, and as the sole heir, you would be free to sell the orchard to the development company that has been eyeing our village borders for months." Dickie Thorne let out a short, nervous laugh, his eyes darting toward the door as if measuring the distance. "That's a tall tale, Miss Marple. Even if Letitia wanted to sell the old man's dirt, what has that to do with me? I'm just a neighbor who happened to be there when the door needed breaking. I was just being a good Samaritan, helping a lady in distress. You can't make a crime out of a bit of manual labor and a broken bolt." "You were a very convenient neighbor, Dickie," Miss Marple replied, her needles never missing a beat, "and a very well-dressed one for someone who claimed he couldn't afford his tab at the Blue Boar last week. I couldn't help but notice that orange cravat. It is a very specific shade, identical to the silk fragment I found on a briar rose behind the hut. Now, why would a young man be lurking in the thorns behind a locked potting shed during a garden party? Unless, of course, he was waiting for a signal that the person inside was finally asleep. You see, Mr. Henderson didn't just decide to swallow pesticide. He was given a very strong sedative in his afternoon tea, a sedative that was masked by the strong, cooling taste of peppermint lozenges. Once he was unconscious, it was a simple matter to enter the hut, place the vial in his hand, and then exit. The confrontation shifted as the secrets of the partnership began to spill out, jagged and ugly. Letitia had provided the sedative and the ledger to create the illusion of despair. Dickie had provided the physical agility to ensure the scene was discovered exactly as planned. They had made a pact born of mutual greed, she to escape the drudgery of the nursery, and he to pay off the gambling debts that had been haunting him for months. But as is often the case with such unholy alliances, the trust between them was as thin as the orange silk that had betrayed them. He was going to change his will. Letitia suddenly burst out, her composure finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces of resentment. He found out I had been lying about the bank. He was going to leave everything to the Horticultural Society as a final insult. 40 years I spent in that house, catering to his every whim, and he was going to throw me out like a withered weed. I deserved that land. It was mine by right of service. I only did what was necessary to secure my own future. Dickie Thorne backed away from the mantelpiece, his face a sickly shade of grey as he realized the weight of her admission. "I didn't kill him, Letitia. You told me he was already dead when I went to slide the bolt from the back slit. You said he'd taken the stuff himself because of the debts. You used me to make it look like a locked room. I never would have helped. If I knew he was just sleeping." Miss Marple sat back, watching the two of them with a profound, sombre clarity. The secrets of the garden were no longer hidden. They were laid out like the stamps at the exhibition, each one a different price, but all paid for in the same dark currency of betrayal. The revelation had transformed the room from a place of comfort to a gallery of exposed souls. Every character in the room had a thread tied to the tragedy, a motive born of either greed or a desperate clinging need for social preservation. Human nature, Miss Marple thought to herself as the silence followed the outburst, is so remarkably consistent. We weave these intricate webs of protection and convenience, and then we are genuinely horrified when the threads begin to pull tight around our own necks. Letitia wanted her freedom, and Dickie wanted his money, but they forgot that a garden is a living thing, and it does not like to be lied to. The orange silk and the peppermint scent were the witnesses they couldn't bribe. She adjusted her shawl, her mind already moving to the next step. The mystery of the bolted hut was becoming a much larger tragedy. She looked toward the door as the sound of a heavy footfall echoed in the hallway. "It is a pity," she whispered to herself, "that people always assume the elderly don't understand the chemistry of a grudge." The truth was out, but the final test of their deception was yet to come. The following morning, the fragile peace of St. Mary Mead was shattered not by a scream, but by the cold, mechanical sound of a heavy iron safe being forced open in the back room of Gillingham's pharmacy. While the village was still digesting the scandalous news of the heated exchange at the vicarage, a secondary crime had been discovered that seemed to turn the entire investigation on its head. The apothecary, Mr. Gillingham, was found slumped over his counter, not dead, but in a state of profound drug-induced stupor. His safe stood wide open, and the village's supply of regulated poisons, specifically the arsenic-based pesticides and concentrated sedatives, had been systematically looted. More importantly, a single blood-stained gardening glove belonging to the late Mr. Henderson was found lying in the center of the pharmacy floor, as if dropped by a fleeing phantom. This new revelation acted like a violent chemical reaction on the village's collective imagination. The prevailing theory, quickly adopted by a frantic and over-caffeinated Inspector Slack, was that the murder of old Mr. Henderson was merely the first move in a much larger, more sinister plot. The inspector now believed that Henderson had not been a victim of suicide or a domestic dispute, but had been silenced by a third party, a mysterious criminal element involved in the illegal bulb trade Miss Marple had hinted at earlier. The robbery at the pharmacy was framed as a desperate act by an accomplice to recover incriminating evidence or to replenish a supply of toxins. This twist successfully shifted the focus away from Letitia and Dickie, reinforcing a deception that the killer was a dangerous outsider who had now turned their sights on the rest of the village. Miss Marple, sitting on a bench in the churchyard to catch the thin October sun, watched as the police searched the hedgerows with a frantic, misplaced energy. She noted the way the villagers now moved in pairs, their eyes darting toward every stranger with a look of terrified suspicion. Yet Miss Marple observed that while the village was looking outward, the real story was still folded neatly inward. She noticed Mr. Gillingham as he was being led to a waiting ambulance. Despite his grogginess, he was clutching his coat pocket with a peculiar, protective ferocity, and she noticed Letitia Henderson, who was standing at her garden gate, looking not frightened but remarkably annoyed by the police presence. "It is quite extraordinary," Miss Marple remarked to Miss Weatherby, who was hovering nearby with a bottle of smelling salts and a look of intense trepidation, "how the appearance of a second crime can make the first one seem so much more complicated than it truly is. It reminds me so much of the time the local grocer's shop was robbed of its finest hams, just after the tax collector had announced a surprise visit. Everyone assumed it was a gang of professional thieves from London, and the poor collector was so distracted by the drama that he never noticed the grocer had 2 sets of account books. We are so very prone to believing in a grand conspiracy when a simple, desperate lie is right in front of us. A blood-stained glove in a pharmacy is a very loud piece of evidence, Caroline, and loud evidence is usually trying to drown out a very quiet truth that someone is desperate to keep buried." Miss Weatherby nodded, her eyes wide as she scanned the road for suspicious vehicles. "But Jane, the poisons! Someone has enough arsenic now to kill half the county. And the blood on the glove. It must mean the killer struggled with Mr. Henderson after all, and the bolt was just a trick. The inspector says it's a professional job, a vendetta over the gold standard secrets. He thinks we are all in grave danger until this mastermind is caught." Miss Marple's needles clicked with a sharp, insistent speed. "It is a professional job, dear, but perhaps not in the way the inspector imagines. I cannot help but wonder why a professional thief would bother to leave a glove behind. In my experience, professionals take their tools with them to avoid the gallows. Only an amateur believes that leaving a clue makes a story more believable. And as for the blood, Mr. Henderson's death was a very clean affair, was it not? No struggle, no wounds, just a man slumped over his bench. So where did the blood on that glove come from? It is almost as if someone took a glove from the potting shed and purposefully stained it with a bit of kitchen meat juice to make the scene look more violent than it was. It is a very theatrical touch, like the red paint used in the village play last spring. The twist had successfully reinforced the killer's deception by providing the external threat the village so craved. To Slack, the case was no longer a domestic tragedy but a high-stakes investigation into a criminal ring. He began questioning the local delivery drivers and searching the rooms of the village inn, convinced that the phantom was hiding in plain sight. But Miss Marple was thinking about the peppermint and the sugar once again. She realized that the pharmacy robbery was a desperate maneuver to explain away the presence of the sedative in Henderson's system. If the sedative was stolen from Gillingham's, then the person who used it could be anyone. It was a smokescreen designed to protect the partnership between Letitia and Dickie by introducing a third, invisible actor who didn't exist. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks of red across the sky, Miss Marple noticed a small detail that the police had missed in their search of the pharmacy. On the windowsill near the forced safe, there was a tiny, sticky smear of orange marmalade. It was a domestic, mundane substance that had no place in a laboratory or a crime scene. She recalled that Mr. Gillingham always had a jar of marmalade with his morning toast in the back room. The robber had not been a professional from London. They had been someone familiar enough with the pharmacy to wait in the back room, perhaps even sharing a cup of tea with the apothecary before drugging him. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, her gaze settling on the apothecary's shop, is so very prone to the dramatic. We see a looted safe and we see a bloodied glove, and we decide that the picture is complete. But a picture is never complete until you understand the small, sticky details. The killer is doubling down, sacrificing the village's peace of mind to ensure the lie survives. But in doing so, they have left a trail of psychological breadcrumbs that lead straight back to the breakfast table. She adjusted her shawl. Her mind settled on the final psychological game. She didn't need to find a phantom. She just needed to make the apothecary remember exactly who had brought him that jar of marmalade. The small, clinical side room of the village infirmary was bathed in the pale, sickly light of an autumn moon that struggled to penetrate the frosted glass of the narrow window. The only sound was the rhythmic, shallow breathing of Mr. Gillingham, the apothecary, who lay beneath a thin white sheet, his face a mask of waxy stillness. Outside, the village was quiet, but inside the narrow corridor, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy, invisible weight of a reckoning. Miss Marple sat in a hard wooden chair by the bed, her knitting needles silent for once, her hands folded calmly over her lavender wool. She looked like a woman who had nowhere else to be, a sentinel of patience in a house of crisis. When the door creaked open, she did not turn her head. She knew the footfall, a quick, nervous patter that tried to be silent but failed because of a loose heel. Letitia Henderson entered the room, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. She looked frayed, her coat buttoned incorrectly and her eyes darting toward the sleeping apothecary with a look that was less concern and more the desperate appraisal of a gambler watching a spinning wheel. She stopped at the foot of the bed, her hands clutching her handbag so tightly that the leather groaned under the pressure. "The nurse says he is still under, Miss Marple," Letitia whispered, her voice a dry, rasping thread that barely disturbed the silence. "She says it is a miracle he didn't take a fatal dose of whatever that brute gave him. Why are you here, Jane? This is a medical matter, not a parish one. The police have the glove, and they have the stolen safe to worry about. There is nothing more for you to find in a sick room at this time of night. You should be home in bed like everyone else who isn't involved in this terrible business." Miss Marple looked up then, her blue eyes reflecting the moonlight with a clarity that seemed to strip away the darkness of the room. "I am here, dear, because I find that in moments like these, the truth has a habit of whispering in the silence, and Mr. Gillingham is a very good listener, even when he is asleep. He has always been a man who notices the little things. I was just thinking, as I sat here, about a similar case I knew in St. Mary Mead years ago. A woman thought she could hide a secret by adding a little something to a friend's evening cocoa. She thought that if the friend slept long enough, the problem would simply vanish. But the trouble with sedatives is that people eventually wake up, and when they do, they remember things they weren't supposed to see, like who held the spoon. Letitia's face twitched, a sudden spasm of the jaw that she quickly smothered with a rigid, unnatural calm. "The man was robbed," she said, her voice rising in defensive pitch. "Some brute from the city must have drugged him to get the keys to the safe and the chemicals. It has nothing to do with my father's death or any village secrets. The police are already looking for a black sedan that was seen near the high street." "You are seeing ghosts where there are only common criminals. Does it have nothing to do with it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice rising just a fraction, a gentle but relentless questioning that filled the small space. "I was thinking about that pharmacy robbery. It was a very noisy crime, was it not? A forced safe, a bloodied glove, a looted cabinet. But I noticed something quite peculiar on the windowsill, a tiny, sticky smear of orange marmalade. Now, a professional thief from London wouldn't stop for a snack during a heist, would they? But someone who was invited into the back room for a talk, someone who knew that Mr. Gillingham always has toast and marmalade at that hour, might easily have brushed against the jar. It is a very domestic touch for such a violent crime. It reminds me of the time the local blacksmith's daughter tried to make a burglary look like a riot, but she forgot to hide the crumbs from the biscuit she'd eaten while she was searching the desk." Letitia took a step back, her shadow lengthening against the white tiled wall like a predatory bird. "You're talking nonsense, Jane." The apothecary is a confused old man who can barely tell his colours apart. He won't remember anything of the sort. He was attacked by a stranger. I think he will remember, Letitia, Miss Marple said, standing up slowly, her small figure suddenly commanding the room with an unexpected gravity. He will remember who brought him that extra jar of marmalade as a gift to cheer him up after your father's passing. And he will remember that the marmalade had a very strong, cooling aftertaste, rather like the peppermint lozenges your father used. You see, the robbery wasn't about the safe at all. It was about the records. You knew that Mr. Gillingham kept a private ledger of those illegal bulbs your father was importing. You needed that ledger gone before the inspector found it, because it proved that the nursery wasn't bankrupt at all. It proved that your father was a wealthy man, and that your story of his financial despair was a total fabrication. You drugged the apothecary to get the keys, staged the robbery to hide the theft of the ledger, and dropped the glove to point the finger at a phantom. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant, muffled chime of the church clock. Letitia's breathing was now as ragged as the man's in the bed. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet deadly, whisper. The psychological game of murder is a wearying one, is it not? You thought that by poisoning the apothecary, just enough to make him sleep, just enough to frame an outsider, you could end the investigation. You planted the evidence to seal the narrative, but you made a mistake that people often make when they are in a hurry. You assumed that because I am old, I have lost my sense of smell. I smelled that peppermint on you yesterday, Letitia, and I saw the marmalade stain on your cuff when you were sitting in the vicarage morning room pretending to grieve. Miss Marple paused, her eyes fixed on Letitia's pale, trembling face. The inspector is in the hallway, dear. He isn't waiting for Mr. Gillingham to wake up. He is waiting for you to realize that the game is over. I suggested he stay just outside the door so he could hear for himself how much you knew about the robber's methods before the safe was even examined.
I wonder, what will you say now? Will you tell him about the ledger, or shall we wait for the apothecary to tell us about the tea you served him?
Letitia Henderson's black beaded handbag hit the floor with a heavy thud, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. Her composure, the carefully cultivated mask of the grieving, devoted daughter, finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of pure resentment. She didn't wail or cry out. Instead, she let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like the air escaping a collapsed lung. She sank onto the edge of the wooden chair, her body shaking with silent, violent tremors. It was the collapse of a woman who had run out of lies and realized that the village she thought she controlled had finally looked behind the curtain of her performance. He was going to give it all away, Letitia hissed, her voice low and filled with a terrifying, cold venom. He was going to leave the nursery and all that land to a society of strangers just to satisfy his ego. I gave him my life, my youth, and 40 years of servitude, and he was going to leave me with nothing but the dirt under his fingernails and a pat on the head. I had to stop him. I deserved that land more than any society. It was mine by right of service. You had a father, Miss Marple said, her voice devoid of its usual softness, sounding instead like the final tolling of a bell, but you chose an orchard instead. You chose the peppermint and the poison, and now you must live with the frost of your own making. The door opened then, and Inspector Slack stepped into the room, his face a complex map of grim satisfaction. He had heard enough. As he moved toward Letitia, Miss Marple calmly picked up her knitting needles. She had watched the critical reaction, the total surrender of the deception. The killer had been engaged, and the truth had been drawn out by the weight of a daughter's own greed. She sat back down as the moonlight shifted across the floor, leaving the room in shadows. The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of the vicarage study, casting long, dusty beams across the heavy oak table where Inspector Slack had laid out his maps and notebooks. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and floor wax, but the atmosphere was one of strained, clinical silence. Sir George sat in the corner, his silver-headed cane resting between his knees, looking like a man whose world had been tilted off its axis. Beside him, Dickie Thorne shifted uncomfortably in a hard chair, his orange silk cravat now looking limp and foolish in the harsh light of day. Into this gathering of men Miss Marple entered with the quiet, unassuming grace of a woman arriving for a committee meeting, her knitting bag over her arm and a small leather-bound ledger clutched in her hand. "Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice a soft but resolute chime in the quiet room, "I am so very grateful you could spare a moment before you conclude your reports. I know you are a man of physical evidence, and physical evidence is so very important when a life is at stake. But sometimes, in our haste to build a case, we fail to notice that the evidence has been arranged for us, much like the scenery in a village play. We have all been looking at the bolted door as if it were an absolute proof of solitude. But a bolt is a very simple mechanism, and in St. Mary Mead, we have always known that what is locked can be unlocked, provided one has the right tool and a sufficient reason to deceive." Slack snorted, crossing his arms over his chest with an air of practiced skepticism. "Now look here, Miss Marple. The case is essentially closed. Letitia Henderson has practically confessed to drugging the apothecary to get that ledger. We have the motive, the theft and the sedative. It's a tragedy of greed, plain and simple. We have the proof that she was managing the accounts to make her father believe he was ruined. What more is there to explain that the handcuffs haven't already settled?" "There is the matter of how the story was told, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, her blue eyes turning toward him with a piercing clarity that silenced his protest. "You believe the door was bolted from the inside because it was broken inward. But as Dr. Haydock pointed out, an old, loose bolt can easily slide home if the door is shaken or if a vibration is applied at the right moment. The murder did not happen in a locked room, it happened in an open one. Letitia didn't need to break in. She simply waited until her father was drowsy from the sedative she had placed in his tea, a tea masked by the strong, cooling scent of peppermint to hide the chemical bitterness. She walked in, placed the vial in his hand, and walked out. She needed it to look like a suicide, to ensure the insurance would pay out, and her father's illegal bulb trade wouldn't be investigated. So she had young Dickie here, who was already in her debt, lurk behind the hut. He used a long, thin garden stake through the ventilation slit at the rear to nudge the bolt home after she had exited. It was a secondary deception designed to satisfy your love for a neat, mechanical conclusion. She laid the heavy ledger on the table, the same one she had recovered from the apothecary's shop after Letitia's failed heist. The weapon was not just the pesticide, Inspector. It was the reputation of the man himself. Letitia and Dickie worked together to make old Mr. Henderson believe he was bankrupt. They altered the accounts, intercepted the bank's letters, and made him feel like a failure in his own garden. They wanted him in a state of despair, so that when he was found dead, no one would question why. But they were careless. They left a fragment of orange silk on a briar rose, a scrap from Dickie's cravat when he was reaching for that ventilation slit. And they left the scent of peppermint, not on the poison, but on the daughter who had been handling the masking agent all afternoon. The room was silent as the weight of her words settled. Slack looked at the orange silk fragment Miss Marple produced from her pocket, and then at Dickie Thorne, whose face had turned a sickly shade of grey. "The pharmacy robbery was the final act of the play," Miss Marple continued, her needles beginning a slow, rhythmic click-clack once more. "Letitia knew the apothecary had seen the real ledger and knew the nursery was actually quite profitable. She couldn't let you talk to him, so she drugged him with his own marmalade. She staged the robbery to make it look like an outsider was responsible, dropping her father's glove to lead you on a wild goose chase. She thought that if she made the crime loud enough, you wouldn't notice how quiet and domestic the truth really was." Miss Marple turned to Sir George, who was watching her with a mixture of awe and terror. "It is the little things that people overlook, Sir George. A crushed flower beneath a heel that wasn't the gardener's, a tiny smear of marmalade on a windowsill, a fragment of silk in a rose bush. People always think that to commit a great crime one must have a grand sweeping plan. But murder in a village is almost always a domestic affair, born of a long simmering resentment or a sudden desperate greed for land and liberty. Letitia didn't want to be a gardener's daughter anymore. She wanted the land for development, and she wanted the money, and she was willing to turn her father into a suicide and the apothecary into a victim to get it. The orange silk was the signature of a man who didn't belong in the thorns, Miss Marple mused, her gaze settling on the inspector. Dickie was the hand, but Letitia was the mind. They thought they were being so very clever with their locked room and their stolen poisons, but they forgot that a village like St. Mary Mead has very long memories and very sharp eyes for what is out of place. We have seen it all before, haven't we, Inspector? The daughter who feels cheated of her youth, the young man who wants an easy life, and the elderly parent who becomes an obstacle to both. It is a story as old as the hills, but it always ends the same way, with a small, forgotten detail that pulls the whole web apart. Slack didn't wait for another word. He barked an order to his sergeant and led Dickie Thorne out of the room, heading toward the cell where Letitia was already being held. The reveal had transformed the study from a place of official business to a gallery of exposed truths. Miss Marple watched them go, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the most lethal crimes are often committed by those who believe they are the most entitled to a better life. The corpse in the bolted garden hut was finally explained, but it wasn't the lock on the door that had been the mystery. It was the lock on the hearts of the two people who had stood on the lawn and watched a man die for the sake of an orchard. She sat back down, the lavender wool moving through her fingers. She had one final reflection to make on the nature of her neighbours, and then she would go home to see to her own garden. The morning of the departure was characterized by that particular kind of stillness that only a village can produce after a great and terrible storm has finally spent its fury. St. Mary Mead seemed to have shrunk under the weight of the week's revelations, the honey-coloured stone cottages huddled closer together, as if trying to shield themselves from the prying eyes of the outside world. The colourful bunting from the chrysanthemum competition still hung listlessly from the eaves of the parish hall, but the wind had frayed the edges, and the once vibrant reds and golds now looked faded and weary, like the remnants of a party that no one wanted to remember. The orchard hut, once the site of such botanical pride, and later such grim tragedy, stood shuttered and silent, the yellow police tape having been replaced by a heavy official padlock. The centre of the village's social gravity had been momentarily displaced, and in its place was a hollow, echoing silence that not even the cheerful chirping of the garden birds could fully dispel. Miss Jane Marple stood on the platform of the small railway station, her suitcase neatly packed and her knitting bag resting in the crook of her arm. She was waiting for the train that would take her to visit her nephew Raymond in London, a journey she often took when the air in her own village became too thick with the residue of human frailty. She watched as a black police car drove slowly past the station entrance, a sight that had become all too common over the last few days. Inside, she knew, were the final statements and the forensic reports that would seal the fate of Letitia Henderson and Dickie Thorne. The daughter who had sought freedom and the young man who had sought fortune were now bound together by a much darker contract than the one they had signed in the shadow of the potting shed. "It is a very sombre business, Jane," Miss Weatherby said, having accompanied her friend to the station to see her off. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her movements still somewhat shaky from the excitement. To think that we all lived alongside such a dark current for so long. Letitia was the very pillar of the horticultural society, and to think she used peppermint and marmalade to commit such horrors. It makes one feel so very vulnerable, as if the very ground beneath our feet isn't quite as solid as we imagined. I don't think I shall ever be able to look at an orange cravat again without feeling a shiver of dread. It really does make one lose faith in the neighbours. We were all so focused on the locked door that we never looked at the people standing right next to us on the lawn. Miss Marple looked at her friend with a gaze that was both compassionate and profoundly realistic. It is the tragedy of the well enough, dear Caroline. We spend our lives pretending that the cracks in the wall aren't there, and then we are surprised when the whole structure collapses because someone pointed at a loose stone. Letitia didn't start as a murderess, she started as a woman who felt she was owed a life she hadn't earned. She loved the idea of the nursery more than the man who built it. It is a very common human failing, though rarely taken to such a lethal extreme. It reminds me so much of poor Mrs. Tilling back in my youth, who was so convinced she deserved a larger garden that she eventually moved the boundary stones in the middle of the night. People will justify almost any cruelty if they believe they are merely correcting an injustice, and Letitia felt her father's life was an injustice to her own ambition. The train whistle echoed through the valley, a sharp, modern sound that seemed to signal the definitive end of the Henderson mystery. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her tweed skirt and adjusting her hat with a practised hand. She thought of old Mr. Henderson, whose pride had been his undoing, and whose love for a gold standard flower had blinded him to the rot in his own home. The village had been stripped bare, its secrets exposed to the harsh light of the law, and now it would have to find a way to rebuild itself on something more substantial than a collection of comfortable lies. The bolted door would remain a part of local legend for years to come, a cautionary tale about how easily we are fooled by the appearance of security and the mechanics of a lock. I suppose the vicar will have to find someone new to manage the parish accounts, Miss Weatherby sighed, looking toward the village spire. But it won't be the same. The trust is gone, Jane. We shall all be looking at each other over the tea table and wondering what else is hidden in the bottom of the sugar bowl. It's as if the frost has come early this year and touched everything with a bit of ice. Even the flowers seem to droop a little lower today, as if they know they were the reason for such a terrible ending. And that, I'm afraid, is the price of the truth, Miss Marple replied, stepping toward the arriving train. It is a cold comfort, but it is a comfort nonetheless. One cannot live in a house of mirrors forever. Eventually, the glass must break so we can see the world as it truly is. St. Mary Mead will recover, but it will be a different place, a more honest place perhaps, even if it is a little less tidy. We often find that once the secrets of the garden are told, the flowers themselves feel much lighter for the telling. The truth is never pleasant when it first arrives, but it is the only thing that allows the soil to be turned for a new season. As the train pulled away, Miss Marple watched the village recede into the distance. She saw the green, the church, and the distant, dark smudge of the Henderson orchard. She felt a profound sense of weariness, the familiar weight of seeing the worst of humanity tucked away behind the best of intentions. But as she opened her knitting bag and retrieved her lavender wool, she felt a small, quiet spark of hope. Human nature was consistent in its failings, yes, but it was also consistent in its resilience. She began to knit, the needles clicking a steady rhythm against the motion of the train, her mind already turning toward the next season's planting in her own garden. She had done what she could, not with a magnifying glass or a chemical set, but with the simple, devastating power of observation and an understanding of the human heart's infinite capacity for self-deception. The bolted door had been opened, and though the contents were grim, the air in the village was finally clear.